72 people died at Grenfell Tower in June 2017. 8 years later, the UK government has just admitted in writing to Parliament that it still does not know how many buildings in this country have dangerous cladding on them. Not roughly how many, not an estimate. They do not know. Up to 7,000 unsafe buildings have not even been identified yet. And right now, today, as many as 3 million people are living inside this gap between what the government promised and what the government has actually done. Mark the date, October 2026. That is when a brand new tax lands on every leaseholder in England, a tax that has nothing to do with fixing your building and everything to do with paying for a crisis the government still cannot measure. And in 2029, then again in 2031, two hard legal deadlines arrived that were supposed to end this nightmare. They will not. I am going to show you exactly why. This is not a story about a crisis that happened in 2017 and is slowly being cleaned up. This is a story about a crisis that is still active, still spreading, and about to get more expensive for the very people it already destroyed. If you own a flat in this country, if you are thinking about buying one, or if you simply want to understand why the property ladder broke for an entire generation, you need every minute of what comes next. By the end of this video, I am going to give you three things. First, the plain language explanation of why a building safety scandal from 2017 is still unresolved in 2026. Second, the real data the government does not want headlines written about, what is actually finished, what is actually still dangerous, and where the money went missing. And third, a practical playbook, the specific legal questions you need to ask if you already own a flat, and the steps that can protect you before October. Stay until the end, because the levy section alone could save you thousands. Let's start with the mechanism, because almost nobody outside the industry actually understands how a building goes from safe to worthless overnight. After Grenfell, lenders panicked, and rightly so. They introduced a requirement called an EWS1 form, an external wall system assessment, before they will lend a single pound against a flat in a building over a certain height. No valid EWS1, no mortgage. No mortgage means no buyer, because cash buyers are a tiny fraction of the market, and they know you are desperate. So they offer you a fraction of what your home is worth. The bank does not discount your flat. The bank values it at zero. Not reduced, zero. That single mechanism is why this crisis behaves differently from a normal housing downturn. A flat with dangerous cladding does not lose 10% of its value. It loses access to 95% of its potential buyers in one afternoon, the moment a surveyor fails a form. Here is the part that should make you angry. The system meant to clear that form, the inspection and remediation pipeline, is the part that has completely broken down. The government's own remediation acceleration plan promises every building over 18 meters remediated by the end of 2029, and every building between 11 and 18 meters by the end of 2031, 12 and 14 years respectively after Grenfell. That is the headline. Here is the data underneath it. As of March 2026, government figures show 2,553 buildings, 11 meters and over have been identified with life-critical fire safety defects that developers have committed to fix. Of those, only 521, 20%, have actually completed remediation. 1 in 5, 8 years in. Of the buildings going through the formal Building Safety Fund, 469 out of 680 have completed works, which sounds better, until you remember that figure only covers buildings that have already been found, assessed, and accepted into a funding scheme. The Public Accounts Committee's own verdict, published this year, states plainly that the government does not know how many buildings have dangerous cladding, does not know how much it will cost, and does not know how long it will take. As many as 3 million people, the committee says, may have been affected by this crisis. Up to 7,000 unsafe buildings have not even been identified. Now let's talk about where the money went, because this is the part that turns incompetence into something closer to a cover-up. The Building Safety Fund was set up to remediate dangerous buildings using a mix of taxpayer money and developer contributions. To get that money moving quickly, the government relaxed some of the usual financial safeguards. The result, according to the Public Accounts Committee's own findings, £500,000 was lost to suspected fraud. That is public money meant for fire safety that simply vanished through gaps the government created itself in the name of speed. And the same report found that London Housing Association saw a 90% drop in social housing starts over the past year, because the money and capacity that should be building new homes is instead being swallowed by remediation costs that should never have existed in the first place. So, who is actually paying for the cladding manufacturers, the companies whose products failed and caused this crisis? The government promised years ago to make manufacturers pay their share. As of this year, that mechanism still does not properly exist. The bill instead lands on leaseholders, on local authorities, and on taxpayers. The polluter does not pay. The victim does. And now, October 2026, the new villain arrives. The Building Safety Levy comes into force, a new charge expected to raise £3.4 billion over the next decade, specifically to fund remediation work. On paper, this is developers paying into a national pot. In practice, every cost a developer absorbs gets built into the price of every new home they sell, which means the levy quietly raises the cost of getting onto the property ladder for first-time buyers who had nothing to do with Grenfell, nothing to do with the cladding scandal, and were not even buying property in 2017. The crisis is now taxing the generation too young to have caused it. Let's look at where you live, because this is not evenly spread across the country. As of the most recent data, Southampton has completed 78% of its identified remediation work. Hackney sits at 48%, Manchester at 45%. If your building falls in a council that has not prioritized this, you could be waiting years longer than someone 2 postcodes away through no fault of your own, with no say in the timeline. It is not just the private sector either. Social housing carries its own version of this failure. As of March 2026, 575 social housing buildings were identified with unsafe cladding, being self-funded by housing associations rather than covered by government schemes. Of those, 65% had started or completed work. That means more than a third had not even begun, paid for out of budgets that should be building the next generation of affordable homes, not patching up the last decade's failures. Separately, local authorities have now taken formal enforcement action under the Housing Act against 863 buildings over 11 meters with suspected unsafe cladding, which tells you something important. Enforcement is rising because voluntary compliance is not working. Councils are being forced to chase landlords who, 8 years on, still have not acted on their own. And underneath all of this sits a quieter cost that rarely makes the headlines: insurance. Buildings still wrapped in unsafe cladding or waiting on remediation are treated by insurers as high-risk fire hazards. Premiums on some affected blocks have risen several 100% since 2017, and that cost is passed straight through to leaseholders via the service charge on top of whatever remediation bill they are already facing. It is a second, quieter bill arriving every single year for a problem the leaseholder did not create and cannot fix alone. Inside that postcode lottery sits a second trap that almost nobody talks about: the qualifying versus non-qualifying leaseholder divide. Under current rules, whether you are protected from these costs depends on technical criteria around your property's value and how many homes you own. Criteria that have nothing to do with whether you can actually afford a bill. Campaign groups working directly with affected leaseholders estimate that as many as 385,000 flats in England are owned by people who do not qualify for protection. These are not landlords with portfolios. These are people who bought a second small flat to help a relative, or who once let out a room, and who now find themselves personally liable for tens of thousands of pounds because of a technicality buried in legislation none of them voted for. This is what that actually looks like for a real person. Picture someone who bought their flat a decade ago, before any of this existed, did everything right, paid their mortgage every month, and one morning receives a letter telling them their share of the building's remediation bill is 30, 50, in some documented cases over £100,000 they cannot sell. The flat is worthless to a mortgage lender until the work is done. They cannot remortgage because no lender will touch a building mid-remediation. They are not behind on payments. They are not reckless. They are simply standing on the wrong side of a line drawn by people who will never have to pay it themselves. Some of these owners are now exploring bankruptcy, not because they mismanaged their finances, but because the country failed to manage a building safety crisis it created. Campaigners working with affected leaseholders report cases of people in their 60s and 70s, years from retirement plans they can no longer afford, still servicing a mortgage on a property a bank now values at nothing. Some have delayed having children. Some have stayed in marriages or shared housing situations they would otherwise have left, simply because they cannot extract the money tied up in a flat nobody will buy. This is not an abstract policy failure. It is a decade of ordinary life decisions, frozen, because a piece of paper called an EWS-1 form has never been signed. Here is the part the government would prefer you did not connect. The new remediation bill, the one bringing criminal penalties, fines, and even prison sentences for landlords who miss the 2029 and 2031 deadlines, sounds like accountability. And in part, it is overdue. But read the small print. The penalties apply to landlords and freeholders who fail to remediate. They do nothing for the leaseholders sitting inside a building that has not even been assessed yet, the 1 in 7,000. A prison sentence in 2032 does not refund a flat that was unsellable for a decade. So where does that leave you if you already own a flat, or you are thinking about buying one? Here is your playbook. Strategy 1. If you own a flat in a building over 11 meters, request your building's EWS-1 status in writing, today from your managing agent. Even if you have no plans to sell, you need to know your exposure before October, not after. If the answer is vague, that vagueness is itself useful information. It tells you the building has not been properly assessed, and you can push your managing agent and your local authority for a timeline in writing. Strategy 2. Check whether you fall into the qualifying or non-qualifying leaseholder category under the Building Safety Act. This single classification determines whether you are legally protected from historical remediation costs. Campaign groups and several free advice services can help you check this without paying a solicitor upfront. If you are non-qualifying, find out now while you still have time to plan rather than discovering it the day a bill lands on your doormat. Strategy 3. If your building has more than one owner facing the same uncertainty, organize collectively. Buildings where leaseholders have formed an active residents association have consistently moved faster through the Building Safety Fund and Cladding Safety Scheme pipelines than buildings where individual owners are fighting alone. A unified group with a paper trail of correspondence is far harder for a freeholder or local authority to ignore than a single voice. This will not fix the national numbers, but it can move your building up the queue. Strategy 4. Before you exchange contracts on any flat, in any building, ask for the service charge accounts for the last 5 years alongside the EWS-1 paperwork. A clean cladding certificate means little if insurance premiums on that building have tripled, and the service charge is climbing faster than your salary. Buyers who only check the fire safety paperwork are still being caught out by the quieter, slower-moving cost sitting right next to it. A solicitor who specializes in leasehold conveyancing, not a generalist, is worth the extra fee here. This is not a corner to cut. None of these strategies undo 8 years of failure. They cannot. What they can do is make sure you are not the next person discovering by letter that you are trapped. Here is where this actually leaves us. 8 years after 72 people died because of failures in building safety, the government that promised it would never happen again still cannot tell you how many buildings are still dangerous. It cannot tell you when the 7,000 unidentified buildings will be found. It has not made the manufacturers responsible to pay their share. And in October, it is asking the next generation of buyers to help cover the bill instead. The deadlines of 2029 and 2031 will arrive. Some buildings will be fixed by then. Many will not be, and the people inside them will simply keep waiting, the way they have been waiting since 2017. The criminal penalties in the new remediation bill might one day put a negligent freeholder in front of a judge. That will not be a moment of justice for the leaseholder who already sold their flat at a 60% loss to get out, or the one who never managed to sell it at all. Accountability arriving a decade late is still better than no accountability, but it is not the same as a problem being solved, and nobody currently living inside one of these buildings should mistake the two. If you live in a flat right now or you are looking at buying one, I want to know what is actually happening on the ground where you are. Has your building had its EWS1 assessment? Are you qualifying or non-qualifying? Tell me in the comments because the official data only tells half this story and the rest of it is sitting in inboxes and letterboxes across this country. In buildings, the government still has not counted. If this video showed you something about your own building you did not know before, that is exactly why this channel exists, and it is exactly why I need you to subscribe. We are tracking this crisis postcode by postcode, deadline by deadline, and the next building safety update could be the one that affects you directly. Hit subscribe now so you do not miss it. And if you want to understand the other half of why flats in this country became almost impossible to sell, go and watch the video on your screen right now, where I break down the 37% of UK flats that are suddenly unsellable in 2026, and exactly what that means for your equity. I will see you in that one.